You're with us today as we are approaching the end of a sermon series in the Old Testament book of Job. If you've been around over the past few weeks, if you've been tracking along with us through the series, you'll know that the book is a question about the issue of suffering, and in particular, innocent suffering. Why do people, asks Job, who are seemingly good and honest and upright and do all the right things, why do they suffer? Why do we live in this kind of world where this kind of thing happens, where people don't seem to get what they deserve, or do get what they don't deserve? There are many ways, in fact, in which that question is answered. Theologians and philosophers down the centuries, as well as everyday thoughtful believers, have agonized with that question. But over the past weeks, we've had at least two major answers to that question ruled out. The book of Job excludes and rejects two possible and significant answers. And the first is what I suppose you could call the Star Wars answer to the question of innocent suffering. If you know the Star Wars films, you'll know that in the films, at the heart of the universe is a mysterious energy called the Force. And the Force is the thing that gives life to everything. But there's also a competing energy called the dark side. And the Force and the dark side are forever locked in a kind of rivalry and competition. And when the dark side is winning, well, that's why there is suffering. That's the cause of pain and suffering in the world. And some answers to the question of suffering picture God and the devil a little bit like that. It's a view of the world with a long history that's called dualism, two rival powers that are forever competing with each other. And whoever has the upper hand, well, that's where suffering might come from. But in the book of Job, we're told clearly and without second thought that that can't be right, that that's not the way the universe works. We're told that God is sovereign over it all, even over those powers that seem to oppose him. They do in some way that we find quite hard to fathom and quite hard to understand and are at some level deeply mysterious. They do belong to him, or at the very least they can only act with and according to the permissions that he gives. The second answer that the book of Job rules out is the answer that I guess you could call the kind of slot machine view of God. It's the view of God and the view of the world that says basically you get what you deserve in this life. In fact, that's what Job's friends believe, and that's what they've been telling him all the way through the book. They keep saying to him again and again, Job, your life is awful. You must have done something awful to have such a disaster happen to you. You're suffering? Well, it must be because you have sinned and sinned greatly. So confess your sins. That's the way to get back into God's good books. But time and again, Job angrily protests against that view. He says, no, that can't be right. I'm not suffering because of what I have done, because I deserve it. And the book tells us that Job was blameless and upright in all that he did. For him, it simply wasn't true that he was suffering as a result and consequence of his sin. And so far in the book, there have been 37 chapters. We haven't read all of them week by week. We've been dipping in and out. But there have been 37 chapters of agonizing dialogue as Job has wrestled with these questions. And as he's done that, Job has actually been calling on God to give an account of himself. Job has been demanding, in effect, his day in court as he's gone through the book. He's been saying, I want to be heard. I want to be vindicated. I want there to be a trial and for everybody to see that I'm in the right and that God is in the wrong. Job wants God to be put on the stand. If Job were a backbench MP, he would have sent in his letter a long, long time ago to the 1922 committee chairman to say, he's just not doing his job properly, I want him gone. That's what Job is saying about God, that he is just not doing what he's supposed to be doing properly. And now, in chapter 38, at long last, At long, long last, it's taken 38 chapters, God speaks. And as he does, there's a kind of sense of relief, isn't there? We're going to get the answers. Finally, we're going to hear what it is that the book has all been leading us towards. God speaks. The answer that Job has been longing for, perhaps the answer that we might be longing for as we have been reading along. Chapter 38, verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the storm. Here it comes. God's finally going to give us the answer. And then, if this is the answer in verse 38, well, it's a bit of a surprising answer, isn't it? It's certainly not the answer that we were expecting, certainly not the answer that Job was expecting. Job wants to put God in the dock. He wants God to speak for himself and justify himself, but when God turns up, things are the other way around. There's no reference to Job's situation in what God says. God doesn't say a single word about what Job has been experiencing. There's no reference to his friends. There are no philosophical answers to the problem of suffering. Instead, God is the one who asks the questions. And in fact, there are two speeches that he makes. We read a bit of the first one in chapters 38 and 39, and a bit of the second one in chapters 40 and 41. And there are 50 questions that God asks Job in his first speech alone. And then there are 18 questions in the second speech. 68 questions in total that God asks Job. And I think we're left thinking at the end of all that, oh, is that it? Is that what's going on here? That can't quite be right, can it? When I was going through the selection process to discern whether I would be recommended for training as a vicar in the Church of England, you were made to do various exercises to find out and discern how vicar-like you are. And one of the exercises that I had to do during that process was I had to write a pastoral letter. I was given a hypothetical situation and told to write to someone who was experiencing some particularly difficult things. If this was God's pastoral letter, I wonder if he would have been recommended for training in the Church of England. I'm not sure. It doesn't seem like a very satisfying answer to the problem of suffering, does it? And yet, at some level, Job is satisfied. In these speeches, he may not receive an answer. He may not get an explanation, but he gets something better. He gets a vision of and an encounter with the living God. And that's the thing that changes everything for him. Which tells us, I think, that Job's questions are not so much philosophical, even though at some level they are, but they are relational questions. Do you remember last week, if you were around last week as we looked at chapter 19, Job was wrestling with this question, is God for me or is he against me? And in this encounter, he finds the answer. God is there. God hasn't abandoned his post. God is there. Even in the midst of Job's suffering, he's present and he cares. Now, we're just going to dip in and out of the two speeches that God makes. We're on page 538, and we're going to jump around just a little bit for the next 15 minutes or so, because there are two aspects of God's own character that he wants to bring to the forefront of Job's mind and heart. Because actually, in seeing God as he does, Job finds reassurance in the midst of what he's going through. So in the first speech, which is chapters 38 and 39, God reveals himself or reminds Job that he is the God who is the creator. He is God the creator. And as soon as God begins to speak, we've seen already, it's clear that he's asking the questions. So God's speech isn't going to be like one of those broadcast interviews you might hear on Radio 4 or see on the news, where the politician tries to take control of the interview by asking loads of questions of the interviewer. Job has longed to have God in the courtroom, and now God is here and the tables are turned. And so he starts questioning Job. And the sense of his first speech is really clear, isn't it? Chapters 38 and 39. Can you, Job, do what I do? Where were you? Were you there, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? When I rolled it out like a canvas and began to mark off what goes where? Or what about the sea, Job, that ancient source of chaos and place of terror? What were you doing when I set its limits and said, this far and no further? Can you do that, Job? Well, how about the sun that rises every day? G.K. Chesterton famously said of God that he never tires of saying to the rising sun, do it again, day after day after day. But could Job give that order? Or show the dawn its place? Or look around at the vast expanses of the earth, Job. Can you tell me about them? The focus moves on to the weather in verses 18 to 38. Job, have you entered the storehouses of snow? Can you arrange the path of a thunderstorm and water a land where nobody lives? And how about the stars that illuminate the night sky? Job, can you call them out? Can you arrange them in place and call them to order night after night after night? Creation, weather, if all of that weren't enough, if you look on to chapter 39, through the whole of chapter 39, God questions Job about the wild animals. So it's on page 539. Job, do you know in chapter 39, verse 1, about the birthing cycles of mountain goats? Is that something you know about, Job? Can you tell me about that? Or what about the wild donkey or the ox? Job, what do you know about those animals, those creatures? Or go on down to verse 13 of chapter 39. What about the ostrich, Job? That's a fairly stupid bird, isn't it? An ostrich. You ever thought about how stupid an ostrich is? It flaps its wings joyfully, but actually it can't even fly. And then it lays its eggs in the sand, verse 14, which is a really silly place to lay eggs because someone's going to walk on them. But then, a bird that has no common sense whatsoever, Job, watch her run. See what she's like when she runs, verse 18. She laughs at the horse and rider. Can you do that, Job? Is that something you would have thought of? To have made a bird like an ostrich that looks so foolish and yet can outrun a horse and a rider? Job, is that something you thought of? Do you see the point? Do you see what God is doing in all of these questions? Job, is this something that you could do? Could you really? Could you really, as you look around at the created order, have done and thought what I did? Can you do these things? I'm sure that you remember that very silly Jim Carrey film. They're all silly Jim Carrey films, aren't they? But the Bruce Almighty, remember Bruce Almighty? God gives the running of the world over to a newsreader called Bruce. And for a while, Bruce loves the power that he has. He turns all the traffic lights green on his way into the office so he can just drive in. He gets his rival at work sent off to cover a news desk in a faraway country. But of course, he can't keep at it for very long. Prayer requests start coming into him as emails. So he opens his inbox and he's just got 13 billion emails to reply to. And so, needing to take a shortcut, he simply hits reply all and yes, and chaos ensues. It's a really, really silly film, but it does get something right, doesn't it? In a way, it's got its own reverence about it because it recognizes that God is God, that God is God, and that human people have a very great capacity for overestimating their capabilities. Now, even though Job hasn't sinned through the book, even though we're told that he is a true worshipper of God, that he is upright and blameless, that he's not suffering because of his fault, Job still needs the reminder that God is God, that he is the creator. And as such, he doesn't owe Job an explanation. Do you see that he said that in chapter 41 in verse 11? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Am I the kind of being who really owes you an explanation? And even if an explanation did arrive, even if God did say to him, this is why these things have happened, would that still have been what Job needed? Actually, what he really needed was he needed to know that God was big enough for him to trust, that God was big enough for him to adore and worship, and that even though he doesn't get the answers that he might want or need, he needs to know that God is big enough for him to trust with the answers. Now, that's a hard lesson, I know. It was a hard lesson for Job, and I suspect that for many people, it wouldn't be sufficient as far as an explanation goes. I suspect that many of our contemporaries, even if they did believe that God existed, would think that he owed them an explanation, would think that he owed them an explanation for what's happening in the world and why it's running as it is. And maybe actually that's how many of us feel. Maybe deep down, although we wouldn't say it here, of course, we think that God owes us an explanation. And yet there is, I think, a real freedom in learning the lesson that Job must learn. God is not our debtor. He doesn't owe us an explanation. But as our creator, he is big enough to be trusted. As our creator, he is big enough to be trusted with our hard questions, with our longing, with our weeping, with our tears, with our hopes and our fears. He is big enough to be trusted. I think that point comes home even more forcefully in God's second speech, chapters 40 and 41. And in this speech, Job finds that God, the creator, is also the God who is Lord over all, including over the forces of evil. We meet two creatures in verses 40 to 41. They're called Behemoth and Leviathan. So Behemoth appears in chapter 40, verse 15, and then Leviathan in chapter 41. And on one level, I think these are probably simply creatures of the natural world. The behemoth is often associated with a hippo, and the Leviathan with a crocodile or possibly a whale, depending on which commentator you like to read. But these creatures are not only creatures of the natural world. These creatures are also, you could say, storybook creatures. They are mythological creatures of the world of the Old Testament. They represent the spiritual forces of evil in the world. I think we're actually much more used to the world of symbols and myth than we might think. There are symbols around us all the time. We're just so used to them, we don't notice them anymore. But think about it this way, perhaps, for a moment. You'll know that at the moment, a new Matrix film came out just a couple of months ago, at the end of last year or the beginning of this year. And the world of the Matrix has given us one of the most potent symbols of the 21st century, without a doubt. All I need to say to you is red pill. And immediately, something's popped into your mind. It's not just a red pill, although you probably are thinking of it, but you're thinking of all that the red pill stands for. The red pill, of course, stands for truth and authenticity, for choosing to know things as they really are, the real rather than the simulated. Now, that's the kind of idea that's going on here. If you said Leviathan to someone who lived at around the time that Job did, they wouldn't just be thinking of a crocodile, although they might think of a crocodile. They'd be thinking of all the kind of spiritual forces that represents. So this is the world of a fire-breathing dragon in chapter 41. And its strength is conveyed in great detail as you read through chapter 41. We're told of its limbs from verse 12 onwards, and verse 14, who dares open the doors of his mouth ringed about with his fearsome teeth. His breath, verse 21, sets coals ablaze and flames dart from his mouth. This is the world of a terrifying, fire-breathing dragon. And we get to the end of the chapter, and the Lord says, over in verse 33 and 34, nothing on earth is its equal. A creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. You think that you have the measure of creation, Job. What about the measure of evil? Can you comprehend the authority and strength of the creature that has been tearing at you with its claws, that has been breathing out fire and smoke? And that creature will later be described by Jesus in John's Gospel as the ruler of this world, by the Apostle Paul as the prince of the power of the air. And the point here isn't just that Job can't control this creature. Of course he can't control this creature. And neither is the point that the creature is out of control. The point is that the problem of evil is much, much more terrifying than even Job can imagine. And yet, God can deal with it. God can deal with it. He is able to restrain the worst that this monster can do. He is the one who keeps it on a leash. He is the Lord, even over this terrifying monster, this symbol of evil, this picture of the Satan who we met in chapters 1 and 2 of the book a few weeks ago. He is Lord, even over this. And I think there's real comfort and hope in that. I grew up in a part of the world where farming was a really big, important part of life on the Welsh borders. And I had a friend at school who was part of a farming family. Every time you go to visit my friend, the first thing you do is you drive into the farmyard and get out of the car. And it was the most terrifying thing that I ever did as a young child, because as soon as you opened the door and put your foot into the farmyard, the first thing that you heard were the dogs. Dogs are a big part of farming life, and they weren't keen on strangers being around the farm. So you'd take all of your courage in your hands and you'd step out of the car and close the door, and all you could hear were 4 or 5 dogs just barking and snarling and kind of yapping at you. And when you're grown up, it's different, isn't it? But when you're 10, it's terrifying. But then the farmer, my friend's dad, he'd just come out of the house. He'd close the front door and he would just say, "Max, Jess, quiet." And that was it. They were. They shut up and went back to the shed. Now, we do, of course, have good reason to be terrified of the evil one. We ought to be, I think, if we have read the New Testament properly. The New Testament tells us that we are held captive by his power. That to turn away from God, to fall into sin, isn't just to land in neutral territory, but is to surrender to his cruel sovereignty. So our only hope in the face of evil is in the God who is Lord over it, and the God who's conquered evil in the most paradoxical way imaginable, by seemingly being defeated by it. Because at the cross, the full power of evil, of which Job experienced only a passing touch, was unleashed. The claws that had been tearing at Job, but restrained, were let loose at God himself, at God the Son. And yet as he dies, for our forgiveness and rises for our justification. So that claim of evil that's held over us is paid and done away with, as we are forgiven and made right. So the power of the evil one is undone. And as we come to the cross once again, we're told that even though we might not find the answers that we're looking for, maybe the answers that we were hoping we'd find as we go through the book of Job over these Sundays, even if we don't find the answers that we want, we're told again that we can trust the one that we're turning to. We can trust the one who holds power over evil and death, the one who died and rose to defeat it.